Good morning. As you can see, I am not Scott Verno. I'm Caleb Bennett, and I am the church administrator here at Community Life United Methodist Church, and it is wonderful to be with you this morning. At Community Life, we love God, we love our neighbor, and we connect people to Jesus. So hopefully you'll see that this morning. Have you ever had a really good idea? Like, you know this is the best idea that you've ever had. I had one of those about 3 weeks ago. I said, Tammy, I have this awesome idea for a Sunday morning worship set. And I think her eyes might have rolled just a little bit. I said, what if we duetted? I said, we could call it Hymns for Him. There you go. This morning, we are in the 5th week of our Influencer series. Now, last week, we got to hear Jen Lusher talk about Barnabas. And Barnabas is one of the lesser-known characters in the Bible, but he has a huge influence on what was written in the New Testament. Paul wrote 13 of the books of the New Testament, and Barnabas encouraged him. As we learned last week, Barnabas means son of an encourager. So this week, we're going to take a look at a story from Jethro and Moses. And you might not know who Jethro was, but you may know who Moses is. And if you like really corny dad jokes, I'm the king of that. And so I came up with an original that I'm going to share with you. And I don't have the copyright yet, so if you get it, feel free to write the Hallmark cards. If you think Moses is the one who built the ark for the great flood, try again. That's a knee slapper right there. Moses is an interesting character. We see Moses was born in Egypt in slavery. He was born at a time where the Egyptian officials were afraid that the Israelites were growing in number, and so they decided to kill all the baby boys. Moses' mother did not let that happen. She built and constructed a basket, which she set Moses in and put him in the Nile River. Now, just so happens that Pharaoh's own daughter was along the reeds in the Nile River, and she found this basket. And Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. Moses grew up his whole life in Pharaoh's household. When he was a teenager, maybe early teens, early 20s, he saw an Egyptian man beating one of his own people, a Hebrew. He killed this man, buried his body in the sand. When the body was found, he fled to Midian because Pharaoh was chasing after him and wanted him dead. In Midian, this is a love story, y'all. I want y'all to know this. If you watched The Notebook and thought that was great, this has got nothing on it. So he goes to Midian, he's sitting down by a well, just like every good love story starts, just sitting by a well. And in comes 7 daughters of the Midianite priest to water their flocks. As they're watering their flocks, some shepherds come and drive out these 7 ladies' flocks. So Moses, being the strong guy he is, says, I'll show them. He walks up and he shoos away the shepherds. Now, I guess it turns out when you shoo away shepherds, you get to marry one of the Midianite priest's daughters. So that's what happened. A little later in the story, I think most of us are familiar with the burning bush, the bush that did not burn as fire was engulfing it. Moses walked up to this bush, and God revealed to him that he was going to go set his people free. Moses said, I'm not your guy. So he took his brother Aaron with him, and he freed his people. Now, this story that we're going to look at takes place after all the plagues have happened, after all the darkness, the frogs, the locusts, the blood, the water turning into blood. It takes place right after that. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 18 today, verse 1. And if you want to know the page number, that's page 120. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountains of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. And we'll stop there. Have you ever had that family member who stayed too long? There's some of us who are family members about an hour, and we're good, right? I think this is kind of maybe what happened with Jethro. If you notice, the text does not show us at all where Moses asked for his family to be returned to him. Jethro just kind of showed up and said, here you go. We'll pick up in verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Now, the miracles that Moses got to experience were pretty radical. I'm sure none of us in this room have seen a sea split in half where we could walk on dry land. I'm sure none of us have watched water turn to blood. But if you notice Jethro's response, he was delighted. When I think of delighted, I think of an Englishman with English breakfast tea and a crumpet, and he's saying he's delighted. If I was Moses, I want something a little more like, wow! You watch the sea get parted? And Jethro's delighted. But influence starts here. Through Moses' influence and through God working through Moses, Jethro, a Midian priest, is converted. That's pretty radical. Somebody who is a priest of another religion is converted to believe in the God of Moses through Moses and through God's workings in Moses' life. That's pretty incredible. We'll pick up in verse 13. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as a judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good." And I'll stop there. I'm a single guy, 26 years old. I do not have a father-in-law, but I've been rest assured that a father-in-law would never tell a son-in-law that he's doing something wrong. By that, I think some of you guys have a different opinion. I was at IHOP last Friday morning having breakfast, and I was with a group of guys, and we were talking about this story here and talking about how the in-laws related to the family. And one of the guys looks at me, he says, "What's the difference between in-laws and outlaws?" And I waited for it because I knew it was something. He goes, "Outlaws are wanted." I just looked at him, I said, "I got to use that." I guess one day I'll figure it out. Verse 18, "You and these people who come to you will only wear themselves out. The work is too heavy for you, and you cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for all the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and these people will go home satisfied." Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all of Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided for themselves. In this passage, we see Jethro offering advice. And this advice was where he used his personal influence. He saw that what Moses was doing was taking a toll on himself and his family. He saw what Moses was doing was not sustainable, that he would wear himself out. And he gave him some advice. And Moses, he didn't say, well, I like this part and I like this part. He took his advice. The capable men Moses chose. I'm no genius, but I imagine that it takes more than 2 or 3 weeks to train capable men, to teach them how to behave, to teach them the decrees of God, to teach them the instructions and the law of the land. Moses took time. He invested personally in these men so that they may carry out what he was originally doing. That's huge. Sometimes we can burden ourselves with so much, and we think we can carry the weight of the world on us, and we're afraid to ask for help. We're afraid to get personal with people. I hope in the next few minutes you can see how personal influence is so important. But if you'll catch verse 27 that I did not read, then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. So Moses said, all right, buddy, thank you. I like that part. About 6 weeks ago, I went to Tractor Supply, and I bought 4 chickens. I've never owned chickens. 2 days later, I had 47 chickens. And that's not a lie. There are things I can tell you about chickens that you never want to know. One of the members here, who shall remain nameless, she said, what do you call somebody who takes care of chickens? She said, a chicken tender. So every time she sees me, I'm the chicken tender. Chickens are very interesting animals. You might have heard of the pecking order they have. I thought this was made up. This is not a made-up thing. The pecking order for roosters is the order they crow in. The lead rooster crows first. If another rooster decides to crow first, they have a disagreement. For hens, it's who pecks the ground first. And if another one pecks the ground first, they have a disagreement. And I think sometimes we have our own sort of pecking order in life. I think sometimes we are afraid to step out of line. We know that God's put on our hearts a moment in which we're supposed to use our personal influence. I think there are times when we feel it within our spirit that there's something that we should say. There's a person that we should talk to. There's somebody we should pray for. I think sometimes we get caught up in maybe looking like we're stepping out of bounds. And I think in those moments sometimes we miss our influence. I grew up in the church from 5 years old on. Went through the children's ministry, did the Wednesday night dinners, VBS, I did all of that fun stuff. When it came time to exit 5th grade, I was going into 6th grade, and that meant youth group. I was scared to death. I can remember the very first night that I was supposed to go to youth. My dad and I were sitting on the couch watching TV. It was about 3:30, and youth started at 5, and I did not want to go. About 3:45, he fell asleep. And I didn't wake him up. I was so scared of meeting intimidating people and meeting people who were older than me that I let that get in my way. And when I found out after going through youth group was that I met people there that I have built relationships with for the rest of my life that have poured into me. My youth director took time out of his day very frequently to pour into me. He taught me worship songs. He gave me scriptures to memorize that I still know to this day that come up in times when I need them. We played foosball for hours on end. If you don't think foosball is ministry, I can tell you otherwise. The time that we spent together and the stuff that he poured into me are things that I will remember for the rest of my life. It's part of the reason why I'm standing before you today. And this morning, as he walked in the door, he said, man, you clean up well. I said, thanks. It was his influence. It was his influence that helped me to lead the youth how he led the youth. It was his influence that taught me that relationships are more important than any timeline or schedule. That's hard sometimes when you've got parents who want them back at a certain time, but you know that the moment that you're spending with this youth is very important. On one of those youth trips, it's called M25. M25 is an inner city mission trip in Atlanta, and it's very unique as far as a youth trip. Probably the most impactful trip I've ever been on in my life. M25 is centered around Matthew 25. And in Matthew 25, Jesus is talking, and he tells them about final judgment. Verse 31 says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Now, this M25 trip, it taught me that making it personal is what counts. As a youth, you go down to the park in Atlanta, inner city, and you play checkers with the homeless. You work in the kitchen. You wash feet of people whose feet have not been washed in a long time. What you see is you find stories of their life. When you talk to them, you see where they've come from in their journey. When you make it personal, it's different than just seeing a face. You see the story behind it. I was recently, 2 weeks ago, at a senior graduation for the youth that I used to be their youth minister. They invited me back, and they have their cap and gown ceremony at the church, have a special Sunday. So in the second service, we're sitting in the cafe. And as we're sitting there, I look up front, about 10 minutes into the service, and there's a little boy. He starts running up and down the first rows. He takes each bulletin off of the rows, one at a time, and rips them, one at a time. Takes each piece individually and walks to the trash can, one by one. At one point, he even took a bulletin and started tapping on the preacher. Now, if you can imagine this, there are looks that are being shot right at the front row towards the boy and his mother. I was sitting next to the SBR chairman at the church. It's kind of the HR department. And he started pulling a piece of paper out of his bulletin. And he was folding and ripping. And the guy running sound texted me. He goes, "What is he doing?" I said, "Just wait." He kept folding that paper, and when he was done, he walked up to the front row. He sat down with that little boy, and he pulled out an origami swan. Now, this is one of those swans that when you pull the tail and the head, the wings flap. This little boy's eyes lit up. And for the next 40 minutes, this little boy was playing with this swan and giving a thumbs up to the guy in the back. Friends, influence doesn't have to be a big, scary thing. Influence can be as simple as making a child's day. It can be as simple as calling your waiter or the cashier by name and having a conversation with them. We never know what's going on in people's life, but the influence that we have each day is so important. So this week, I'm going to challenge you. In what space do you have influence? In what space do you have influence? And in that moment, when you know that you have a time to pour into somebody, will you take it? In just a minute, I'm going to close in prayer, but the altar will be open for those who need prayer. Will you pray with me? God, I thank you so much for your word. God, I thank you for Jethro and Moses and for the influence that both of them had on each other and on the whole people of Israel. God, I thank you for the people who have poured into me, my life, God. God, I pray this week that we'll each find an opportunity that we can provide that influence to somebody who may need it. God, be with us as we go. Amen.
It was my cross you bore, so I could live in the freedom you died for. And now my life is yours, and I will sing of your goodness forevermore. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. And now my shame is gone. I stand amazed in your love undeniable. Your grace goes on, and I will sing of your goodness forevermore. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name.
I believe that our personal influence starts with a very personal relationship with Jesus. Jesus had the absolute right to be first, but he chose to be the very last. The most beautiful thing about our personal influence is that we have the ability, we have been invited into this relationship to possibly change somebody else's eternity. We have been invited into this story to help grow God's kingdom. Whether that influence is as small as making an origami swan, or if it's literally saving somebody's life and them seeing the light in you and them giving their life to Christ. Please don't ever discount the influence that our God, that your Lord Jesus has given to you. Because for him, no influence is small. It is all huge because our influence helps him build his kingdom. Would you stand and pray with me? Father God, we thank you for inviting us into the fold, God, for inviting us into the building of your kingdom. And God, I pray that we would just continue to live into the influence that you have given us, God, and not to compare our influence to the one beside us, but God, that we would just focus on our influence, knowing from whom it has come from, God. You have designed us each individually, yet in your beautiful image. So God, let us live into the influence that comes from you. God, we love you. and we thank you. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray. Amen. You'll have a great week.